Hi everybody, and welcome to video number 14 on warfare through time. And we're in the industrial era, ladies and gentlemen. We're looking at the nature of war, and this time we're looking at the armies. Now, I'm going to do the armies in two separate videos. Part 1, this one, and part 2, the next one. And the reason for that is quite simple. Let's go back to what we were talking about in the previous video. The rate of change in the industrial period. And in the previous video, I suggested that 1700 to 1850 in the nature of change in weapons was very, very slow. And most of the change happened after 1850. And it's pretty much still the same as regards the armies. So this video, I will look at the 150 years, 1700 to 1850, what was happening in the armies in the industrial period. And then part 2, the next video, I will look at the change, the 50 years, 1850 to 1900, looking at the change in the armies. So that's the setup for these next two videos. Now, in the industrial era, change was getting nearer, but continuity was still a thing in the armies of the king. So this video is mainly showing you continuity, but some changes. The next video will show you more changes with a little bit of continuity. So they're mirror images reversing each other. So let's start. You've noticed I've got a crown on, and I mentioned the king in that silly little poem there. I'll come back to the king in a minute. When we're talking about the nature of war and the armies, we're talking about things like size of the army, composition, the types of soldier in the army, and then strategy and tactics. So that's what I'll concentrate on in this video. Remember the previous video, 1700 to 1850, there was not much change as regards weapons. And it was the same situation for the size of the army. We are talking same. Now, a permanent standing army. In practice, Britain had had one since about 1700. But in reality, in theory, they never actually said we've got a permanent standing army until they passed a law in 1775. They did have one, but they just didn't admit it. Now, apart from times of war, when obviously the size of the army would increase, the size of this permanent standing army pretty much stayed the same, on average about 40 to 50, 60,000 men. So they did have a regular permanent army of about 50,000 men. That did not change. What about composition of army? What about the types of soldiers? Well, again, there's very, very, very slow change. The infantry were the biggest part of the army, and it went from about 75% up to 80%, a very, very gradual increase, a slow rise. Equally, the cavalry had a very slow decline. It went from 20% down to about 15%, a very gradual decline as the infantry increased. Artillery stayed the same at about 5% of the army. So there we see the composition of the army pretty much stayed the same. The size of the army stayed the same. Composition of the army has pretty much stayed the same. What about strategy? Well, if you go back to the previous period, we had something called limited warfare. Most leaders of the army, most kings or most generals, tried to resist large-scale battles. Instead, they preferred a limited style of warfare, raids, skirmishes, try and say that properly, raids, skirmishes, sieges. they were preferred to full-scale battle. Why would that be? Have you got any ideas? Well, here's 3 or 4 reasons for you. The first one, I refer you to the crown. In the 1700s, quite often, the armies were still led by the king. For example, King George II, 1743, at the Battle of Dettingen. Great name, Dettingen. Now, at Dettingen, if the king is there at the battlefield, just the way that, for example, King Edward was there at the Battle of Falkirk, King Charles was there at the Battle of Naseby, if the king is still there, then we're talking continuity. Also, the kings did not want to risk a potential end to their dynasty or a weakening of their dynasty if they were attacked and killed. So they tried to avoid large-scale battles. Also, remember I've said the size of the army was still quite small. Well, as the muskets improved, as the cannons improved, as the weapons got more deadly, if you have a great big battle, you are risking huge losses. Another example, the Battle of Malplaquet, 1709. Britain and its allies lost 24,000 men. Well, they couldn't afford to sustain such losses, so they would try to avoid big set-piece battles if they could, and they preferred instead this limited warfare. Another reason why the limited warfare was more preferable to the battles. In the 1700s, transport and communications were still slow and basic. A good example of that, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. I'll do a video on that in the future. When news of the win, Waterloo's in Belgium, when news of the win was carried from Belgium to Britain, how did it get carried across? Homing pigeon. That shows the level of basic communication. Long wars and big armies and big battles, they were difficult to manage. So therefore, the leaders would try to avoid them and prefer instead limited warfare. And the final one, particularly for Britain, Britain of course is an island, and they were able to use the Channel as a barrier, as a defence, and instead they would use the navy to prevent invasion rather than pumping all their money into huge armies and huge large scale battles. So we see there the strategy still continuity to aim towards this limited warfare. Now, what about actual tactics? Well, as regards tactics, some stayed the same, but there were some changes, as I'll try to explain in this next part of the video. Let's start with infantry, the foot soldiers. They were the dominant force on the battlefield. Go back to the earlier periods, and we've seen that infantry would often line up in long lines. Well, here's one change. When the muskets came in, the lines were often in 4s or 6s, because if you remember, it took so long to reload the musket that one line would either go to the back, or you would have them sort of kneeling down slightly above and then standing to try and fire at a rapid rate because of the length of time to reload. But as it got quicker and quicker to reload the muskets, you could have longer lines because you don't have to wait as long to reload. So therefore, one of the changes was that the infantry lines became longer, and 4 lines could become 2 lines. So that's one of the changes. But then, as the infantry approached, the enemy infantry, they no longer had time to reload the musket because they were getting too close. And then we go to the old hand-to-hand combat, sometimes referred to as melee in the previous eras. So there is an example of continuity. Another slight change was to do with marching. Now then, the marching became more rhythmic. They had to march in time together. Why would that be? Any ideas? Bonus points if you said it was to do with formation. Because of the fluidity of battles now, sometimes that soldiers would have to change formation quickly, and therefore the march, the tapping out of the march, would signal a different type of manoeuvre. That was a change. Now, when the infantry were attacking, sometimes they would sort of put themselves almost like in the shape of an arrow-shaped column to try and burst through the enemy infantry lines. When they were in defence, they often formed the square. And now the square is an example of continuity, because we've seen the square before, back in early modern period. Okay? Also, if you want to link it further back, the idea of some sort of shape as a defence, the square in industrial era, links very closely back all the way to medieval. Think of the schiltrons, the Scottish schiltrons at the Battle of Falkirk. And although the shape was slightly different, it was a bit like a donut, the schiltron, compared to the square, the purpose is still the same. It's a good shape for defence. Now, I mentioned just a minute or so ago this idea of movement, rapid manoeuvres. If you are moving your soldiers quickly on the battlefield, it shows the importance of a very good general. The value of having a good general increased. For example, Duke of Wellington, considered to be one of the top generals. They would have to think of a strategy and try and implement that, but they would have to make key decisions during a battle and try and react to what's in front of them and send out a message that we need that signal because we need these men to move there. So we see the importance of generals coming in even more as the industrial period continues. So that's the infantry, the foot soldiers. What about artillery? Well, if you link back to the previous video, I did mention that lighter field guns, lighter field artillery were being introduced. More mobility, more fluid battle plans. For example, first off, you could put your artillery, your cannons, in front of your infantry to defend them. Or you could maybe move them inside your square for extra safety and protection. Or you could move them up onto higher ground to bombard an enemy. So again, this would be a key decision or a strategy of a successful general. An example, again, Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, Wellington had 216 guns at his disposal, showing slowly the importance of artillery begins to grow. The final soldiers for tactics, the cavalry. Now, I'll mention the cavalry more in my next video as well, but just to introduce the idea here. There was a slow, gradual change, a move away from a frontal attack, a charge. Hundreds of very brave men, all on horseback, with a lance or a sword, charging forward, charge, and roaring at the enemy. That had been a tactic in previous times. We see gradually a move away from that. Because, any ideas? Well done. If you were able to link this, the decline in the use of cavalry for charge, with the improvement in weapons. More rapid musket fire meant that the cavalry would be very vulnerable. In the old days, the charging horse could actually reach the infantry before they'd had time to reload very often. But if the infantry are firing their muskets quicker, obviously there's more coming at the cavalry and the horses cannot run any quicker, so therefore the cavalry is very vulnerable to improved musket fire. 1700, the Duke of Marlborough, one of the top generals, used the frontal attack, the charge. 1800s, the Duke of Wellington tended not to use it. There is a change. Instead, cavalry was used for different tasks: scouting, harassing, skirmishing, raiding. So there were some changes, but they were quite slow and gradual. Now, just to finish, why? Why were the changes from 1700 to 1850 so slow? Why was there still so much continuity? Well, here's a couple of things for you. Social attitudes, the attitudes of people in society. They did not really want a big army. Why not? Well, it costs. Higher taxes. That's unpopular. People said no. So that's one reason why you didn't get a big army. A second reason, big army, many people thought that's a challenge, that's a threat to our political freedom. We don't want that, it's unpopular, therefore no to a big army. So that was one of the reasons which is stopping the change and which is why the army still remained relatively small. Social attitudes. Something else to consider, political attitudes. England, Britain, was basically quite a conservative society, conservative with a small c, maybe resistant to change. A good example of that was looking across the English Channel to France, the French Revolution 1789, where the King of France was executed by the guillotine, beheaded, and the monarchy was overthrown. The French Revolution 1789. Many people back here in Britain reacted in horror, particularly the rich, the powerful people. They were scared of that threat and they're saying no to change. We do not want change, including changes in the army. So again, the army did not change very much. Something else to consider are the people themselves. Now, in this video, I've already mentioned the Duke of Wellington, a successful general. Yes, but after the Battle of Waterloo, which was a victory, after 1815, Wellington is in charge of the army, and he resisted attempts to modernise that army because he remembered it as the army he was in charge of. So in a way, Wellington was blocking change. He was an obstacle to change because he was quite conservative and resistant to modern ideas. And the final point, industry, industrial factors. I've mentioned the Industrial Revolution. Yes, throughout the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution is beginning to take off. But it really explodes after 1850. In the 1700s, yes, we had people like John Iron Mad Wilkinson, but real change from industry happened after 1850. So therefore, the changes in the weapons, the changes in the armies, the changes in transport will impact after 1850, which is the next video. So, there we have part one. I've tried to show you, although there were some changes 1700 to 1850, they were slow and gradual. And I've also tried to show you there were quite a few things that stayed the same 1700 to 1850 in the armies. Now, as I've said, 1850 to 1900, now that was a time of change. So, hopefully, This video has been useful for showing you continuity and a little bit of change. The next video will show you change and a little bit of continuity. Hope it's been useful, as ever. Speak to you soon. All the best now.